Alright, what's up gang? Welcome back to another video in our series on the Roman world and Christianity. This video is going to be about the Roman people, and specifically how did some of the social customs of the Roman people influence the world in which we live today. That's what we'll be taking a look at in this video. So again, I've sent along some notes to go with this video. If you're following along on the Module 6 Stark Notes, this will be in section 3B, which is on the Roman people. You'll find it located in page 6 of those notes. So where we left off in some of our previous videos, first of all, again, we talked about how after the Punic Wars and everything like that, Rome had unchecked expansion, grew into this massive empire. As you can see in the picture of the video, this massive empire that just surrounded the Mediterranean Sea. Now, coming with that, you had a lot of economic chaos, inequality, military upheaval, civil wars, all these destabilizing factors that would inevitably lead to a switch from them being an indirect democracy to an imperial monarchy, i.e., this was the switch from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. And then finally, the first leader of the Roman Empire, the first monarch that they had, was the Emperor Augustus. And his reign and the government reforms that he put in place kicked off a 200-year period of peace and stability and prosperity throughout the Roman Empire. And this is what was known as the Pax Romana. And today we're going to take a look at some aspects of that Pax Romana. We're going to look at it over the course of the next few videos. But specifically today we'll be looking at the makeup of the people in Pax Romana and how they were organized and what their social lives were like. Now, I talked about this when we did our video on the government in the Roman Republic, but it's worth repeating. Rome had a very strict social hierarchy. They had people classified into different groups within their society. This didn't mean that you couldn't move up and down. In fact, there were some people that moved their way up from the slave class into the plebeian class, and some people moved down. But again, they had strict groups that you were categorized into. At the very top of this grouping was what was known as the patrician class. I'll go ahead and circle that here. All right, that patrician class, again, these were those wealthy land-owning families, the wealthiest people in Roman society. The way that they described it, all of these people could trace their roots and their lineage, their family history, back to the original founding families of Rome. At least that's what they argued. They were also the ones in society that could become a senator or a consul. Right? Those two government bodies, and even the emperor himself, was only restricted to members of the patrician class. Below that, you had what was called the plebeian class, all right? Now, the plebeians were still considered to be citizens in Roman society, but these were the lower class citizens. They were members such as farmers, merchants, artisans. A lot of your soldiers were members of the plebeian class. You also had members that were free people that lived in Roman territories, so foreigners in Roman society. Again, these were your members of the lower class citizens. They still had political rights, at least the men in these groups, not the women. But the men in these groups still had political rights. They could vote and they could hold office in the assemblies in Roman society. Finally, below all that, you had slaves and free men. Now, slaves and free men, some historians argue that they made up to a third, if not more, of Roman society. In some cases, they said it was even up to half the people in Roman society. We'll talk more about slaves in general in another slide, but just understand, most of them came from military conquests of other places, places that Rome had conquered, but they weren't all just farm workers. A lot of them could have been doing things such as working as teachers or entertainers or working as philosophies. The only thing was that, again, these people were considered property of others. Or, if they were free men, that just meant they were freed slaves. Now, these people, the free men, were not property of others, but they still could not hold citizen rights. They weren't allowed to vote, and they weren't allowed to run for public office. All right, let's talk a little bit about the gap between the rich and the poor. So we mentioned that leading up to the collapse of the Roman Republic, one of the destabilizing factors was growing inequality, economic inequality between the richest in society and the poorest in society. During the wealth and prosperity of the Pax Romana started by Emperor Augustus, more and more people became wealthy, but it didn't necessarily close this inequality gap between the rich and the poor. Those wealthy patricians in many cases just became more and more wealthy. You can see up here, many of them lived in these large countryside estates known as villas. We have a picture of one of those right here. Those villas were often massive mansions with elaborate mosaic artwork or fresco artwork. You can see some things that they had in there. A lot of times they had bathing pools or things like wine gardens where these wealthy landowners would host other people. A lot of their methods of entertainment and hosting others and a lot of their social gathering places would go on to influence Western society moving forward. Those wealthy men, they were also the only ones who could afford to get into politics. So we talked about how the plebeians held certain political offices in the assemblies, but it became rarer and rarer. And the reason for this was that politicians in Roman society were not paid. They did not pay these politicians, so the politicians had to be able to afford to live off of their own wealth. This is one of the big reasons that mostly the wealthy people were the ones running political society. When it came to the poorer classes, sometimes they still worked on farms, but more and more, as Rome grew, they ended up crowding into the big cities, living on top of one another, living in these tightly packed apartments. Oftentimes there were a lot of fire risks involved because they were burning fires. So again, a lot of them ended up crowded in these cities. And in order to keep those people happy and keep them from revolting, a lot of times the government leaders would provide things like free food or free entertainment for them to try and distract them from their normal situations. In fact, the most famous quote associated with this is one from a Roman senator known as Juvenal, who said, "Give them bread and give them circuses, and they will never revolt." In other words, keep the poor people fed and keep them entertained, and they won't revolt. They tried to view that entertainment like circuses, races, athletic games, and gladiator games as a distraction from their position in society. Now, as I've mentioned before, slavery was also a big part of the Roman economy. Slaves at certain points, men and women who were held as property by another, were considered as high as 1/3 of the entire Roman population. So 1 in every 3 people in the Roman Empire at certain points was a slave of another person. These people, like we said, were treated as property of their owners. They could be bought, sold, they could be rewarded, they could be punished. In some cases, they could even be set free by their owners, or they could be put to death. It was all whatever the owner of that slave decided was best. Now, a big misconception about Roman slavery was that it was race-based slavery, that it was Roman people enslaving African people and Asian people. They did have African and Asian people among their ranks, but they also had a lot of fellow European people among their slaves. It was really just people that they had conquered in their wars of conquest, around the different regions of the Roman Empire. In fact, Germanic people made up a large, large portion of the slaves in the Roman Empire. Now, these slaves could have worked various different occupations. In many cases, they worked, on the farms like you would have seen in American slavery. But in a lot of cases, they also worked as household servants. In many cases, they were also put into gladiatorial combat. And we'll talk more about the gladiator games in another video that I'm going to put out. But again, this was another role that they played in society, fighting one another to the death. But sometimes slaves could also hold other special occupations. Slaves in some cases were viewed as very, very valuable, especially some of those slaves from conquered lands that maybe held some sort of intellectual value. Maybe you had a slave who was part of a people that were conquered, but before that, they were a great mathematician or a great philosopher. Sometimes these slaves would just, their job would be to teach others in various fields. Now, family life in the Roman world was considered to be very important as well. The Romans had what you would call a patriarchal society. In other words, the men were considered most important. Um, the Romans had a concept known as paterfamilias. And this was the idea that the oldest male of a family unit was the one who controlled that entire family. So imagine that it was the case that basically a grandfather, or in some cases even a great-grandfather, was the one who made decisions for the entire family. This man would oversee his wife, their sons wives, their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, as well as all of the slaves of that family were considered to be part of the family unit. They were just seen as property. This was something that would really emphasize obedience and religious devotion in Roman society. Now, another big thing in Roman society was adoption. If you were a wealthy landowner and you didn't have any male sons, you might adopt a boy from among the poorer classes or even among the slave classes to become your new son. The idea of this was to reinforce that notion that men were the ones who ran society. So maybe you only had daughters to inherit your land. You might adopt a son who then you could have passed down your family name. Now, among the women in Roman society, they had very little political rights. They could not vote or run for office, but among the upper classes, they could inherit property in some cases. In the middle classes, they could work as merchants or artisans. And then, kind of the lower down you got, the more rights they had, the more power they had within their individual families. Also, as you can see there, pets were a common aspect of Roman society. And here you can see a little painting, some mosaic artwork of a Roman dog, and they used leashes and collars with them. So a little bit also about how do scientists and how do historians and archaeologists, how do they know about Roman life? Well, a lot of these Roman cities, most notably Pompeii and Herculaneum, were preserved in volcanic ash after the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. When that volcano erupted, it completely destroyed those cities, but the volcanic ash would actually go on to preserve a lot of those artifacts, including human and animal bodies. It's pretty interesting if you look at pictures of those, you can see images of human bodies still kind of huddled up. You can see the outlines of them and where they were left when the volcano erupted. But they found a lot of other well-preserved artifacts, including, you can see here, coins, jewelry that people wear, that people wore in those cases, even little things. If you're wondering what this picture is, this is a picture of a baked loaf of bread. In some cases, the volcano even preserved the food that the Romans had left over in their houses when it erupted. So in summary, just to recap some of the key points of this video, all right? Rome had a strict social hierarchy where people fell into different classes, whether you were patricians, plebeians, or non-citizens, i.e. the slaves and freedmen of their society. Economic inequality was still a big part of the Roman world, even during the prosperity of the Pax Romana. Slavery was also a major part in their society, and slaves played many different roles, whether it was working on a farm, working as a servant in a house, fighting in the gladiator games, or even in some cases being forced to work as teachers or work as government administrators or things like that. Another important thing to remember is that men dominated the social order, this idea of paterfamilias, the main patron of each family. And then finally, how we know a lot about Roman society comes from the archaeological discoveries of preserved remains that they found in a lot of these Roman cities. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'm going to keep putting out some more about the Roman world and Christianity. Just understand, remember, you guys should keep checking back on the messages that I put out in View and the Remind app and in Canvas. Just make sure you're staying up to date. We're going to start classes again on Monday, April 20th. Hope to see you guys, in the digital realm soon, and hope you guys are staying safe and staying healthy out there. Take care, everyone.